Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show with the deepest, darkest secrets. I'm Christy Powell, and I'm joined again tonight by friend and colleague Andy Lane of Andy Lane Counseling. Thanks for being here.
Yo, hey, happy to be here.
Yeah, glad to have you. Tonight, we are going to be unpacking our darker selves, so give us a call with your stories and your questions. We're at 512-991-9242. Or you can catch us at tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now. All right. That music means that we are starting this episode the way we start every week with what's turning us on this week. Buddy, thanks for being here. What's got you turned on right now?
Man, I just bought this cookbook. It's called Foodheim. Eric Warheim from Tim and Eric, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he just put out a new book, and I got a signed copy, so I'm so stoked on that. Yes, and so right before the show, I made this awesome pasta, and he says you need to sing to your pasta whenever you're making it, or to the tomato sauce, and you have to say you love it. And so that's what's turning me on, is specifically the tomato sauce I made.
We're off to a sexy start. I don't know about you. It's something about once you get past 30, tomato sauce starts being a lot sexier.
Are you a chef? Do you cook?
I am not a chef. I do cook. My dad's been in restaurants his whole life. He got me started off. Growing up, it was always like, stay in school, don't do drugs, and never work in a restaurant. And then when I was 15, he gave me my first job working in a restaurant. And I did that for 11 years. Loved it. Miss it.
Where was it at? Like what type of food?
Oh, man, all over during that time. The bulk of it was in College Station, working at a little deli bistro bakery where we made everything from scratch. All of our sandwiches were served on bread we made ourselves. It was a good time.
That's cool. What's turning you on, Christy?
Yeah. Well, I guess I want to mention the new warning card at the beginning of our show, talking about the explicit content. So far, new viewers might be a little surprised to hear that, since we're talking about sandwiches and pasta sauce. But
pasta sauce,
I guess I'm deeply proud to tell my mother that this is what I've chosen for my profession. But no, for real, in getting ready for next week's episode, when we're going to have Dr. Anna Sarkeesian back on the show, she sent me information about her new Imaginarium. There's an app that's coming for this new online community. Folks can actually kind of check it out in the beta right now at anna'imaginarium.com. And I really encourage you to do so. It sounds like a really exciting community and a good time. There's a lot of science. There's a lot of sex. There's a lot of philosophy. It's kind of squarely in the secular sexuality wheelhouse. I'm sure that we'll be talking about it more with Dr. Anna next week, but I'd love to give folks a jump on the opportunity to see a little bit about what we're going into, because it's a good time.
That's rad.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Well, let's get into the conversation a little bit. We're setting the stage. Can you give us a little bit of context or just some understanding of who Carl Jung is before we start talking about shadow work and modern counseling and philosophy and all these things?
Yeah, so to preface, I'm not a Jungian analyst. Sure. I use a lot of Jung in my work for his concepts and whatnot. And I do see a Jungian analyst every week. I think next week will be like our 50-something session. So I'm not by no means an expert, but I love it. I love it so much. So Yeah, that's where I'm coming from. But Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist who, was famous kind of at the turn of the century. Was buddies with Freud and Alfred Adler, and he's kind of responsible for personality tests.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about like the Myers-Briggs or any type of type indicator, it's because of him. And the reason why he created that was because he noticed a difference between Adler, and Freud, and was like, what the hell is going on? They're so different than me, but they're really brilliant. So the Myers-Briggs kind of based itself off of his original personality test. So anyway, Jung is a psychoanalyst. He's old school. He's the foundation for a lot of theories like internal family systems. Mm-hmm. I think is kind of based off of what he set in motion of like the different parts work that you have. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of art out there that's based on Jung. I think Dali, I believe, don't quote me on this, was an Alisand of Jung. Mm-hmm. So, Salvador Dali. I know that Hermann Hesse was. So a lot of art is kind of based on Jung. The band Tool. if you like the band right? Tool.
Well, you mentioned before the show that his work in particular resonates with artists, I know that we'll get into it a little bit, but there's I suppose a little bit of conflict between that more artistically driven personality type, if we're gonna use that Jungian notion, versus like the more skeptical or scientifically minded personality type. Is that part of what we're getting into here?
Kind of, yeah. And what's interesting about that specifically is Jung was that scientific type. He was not feelings oriented. Freud was. So I guess Jung would be, if it's an, E-N something J, he's a T. He's the thinking. Freud is the F. So Jung always wanted to kind of have the scientific community back him, and was really sad whenever he died. He said that only the poets would understand where he's coming from, and he really wanted some more validity. So it's really cool that theories such as, what did I say? Internal family systems ended up coming from that. Yeah. I can't hear you. I don't know what happened, but I can't hear your microphone. Oh, gotcha. So, yeah, and it's cool that we're talking about Jung also, because specifically shadow work is based on, we'll get into it in a second, but it's kind of a spooky place because we're nearing Halloween. And so October is right around, or Halloween's right around the corner. And so I'm stoked to be here to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, are you hearing me now?
Hearing you now, brother.
Okay, perfect. Super sorry about that. I think I unplugged it, which just stresses everybody out. Forgive me. Let's talk a little bit about just the basics of Jungian psychology. I know that we're not going to be able to really do justice to his body of work, but before we get into some of this understanding of shadow work and then talk about whether or not these things can be scientifically validated and what kind of value they have for skeptics, I'd love to have at least some sort of overview of what we're actually discussing here. What are some of the major tenets we should understand?
So one of the things, and I looked at the show notes. We're not really going to get into this today, but my favorite thing about Jung, and I think his biggest piece of work, is the idea of individuation. So if you've heard of what's his name, Erik Erikson?
Sure.
Remember him from grad school? It's the idea of the false self and the true self.
Mm-hmm.
That was taken from Jung. So Jung does a lot of kind of, I guess, questioning authority and questioning kind of external authority to kind of bring in the true self of who you're supposed to become and be. So it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of stuff. But Jung has the anima and the animus. That's him. Active imagination. That's him. The collective unconscious is him. The ego is Freud, but Jung has that as well. And then there's the shadow. Does that answer your question?
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to talk about it because he's so much stuff. It's so dense.
No, there's a lot here, and I'm already noticing a lot of it kind of falls into that like unverifiable sort of metaphorical language type of direction, which I think it's interesting to make a little bit of space for, even if we keep it on a little bit of a tight leash. But as we're getting into this, let's talk a little bit about the shadow and what shadow work actually looks like. How does that help us understand ourselves and our own psychology?
So the shadow, I guess you could use a working definition, would be that about myself that I cannot tolerate consciously.
Okay.
So that means like a negative thing or a positive thing. There could be a golden shadow, or there could be like, something that is too taboo. So for a lot of your listeners, there's a lot of people who came from religion, and at one point there was a shadow that was that of doubt. What if what I'm doing is wrong? Like, what if what I believe right now is totally not true? And so repressing that question of doubt is repressing the shadow. So in that sense, that's a difficult place to go to question your entire worldview and your entire value system and reality. But going there makes it to where you are more yourself. One of the big things with Jung is he kind of says the goal in life is not to be good or to be perfect. It's to be whole and to be balanced. And so if you think about, I guess, meditating upon those darker parts of ourselves, or kind of the more taboo parts of ourselves that maybe later on wouldn't be taboo, they might make us more whole and make us better at critical thinking.
Yeah, working with this kind of community, folks who are likely to watch this show, people who either because of religion or some other force feel deeply ashamed about maybe their gender, about their orientation, or even just their kinks and their sexual and romantic interest in these kinds of things. I do a lot of work that is focused around sort of mindful self-awareness, around mindful self-compassion, and these different strategies for, I guess, embracing some of those pieces of ourselves that we might be kind of blinded to because they're inconvenient, because we don't really want them in our lives. The work of folks like Tara Brach or Kristen Neff, as they talk about like the trance of unworthiness and these kinds of things. Does that line up with Jung's notion of the shadow, or do I have it wrong?
I think it does. Because if you think about unworthiness, like, where does that come from? Where would unworthiness come from other than the shadow, right? Other than that place that you just kind of lodge it away. It's called the shadow because you don't see it. It's called the shadow because you repress it. You put it in the closet. You put it deep in a dark place where there's like cobwebs and spiders and shit. So bringing it out feels uncomfortable. You know, and so shadow work looks like, well, I'm going to explore this thing that I don't like to talk about, that I can't tolerate consciously, like I said before. And so a lot of times whenever you have a therapist who's very direct with you, they'll say, you know, Christy, I've noticed that whenever we talk, you kind of look the other way and you don't address a certain problem. That's addressing your shadow. Mm-hmm. But then also likewise with your partner, like if your partner is like, you know, Christy, you are so funny and I don't think you realize it. That's the golden shadows. That's a good thing. It's like bringing it to consciousness. I think the one thing about the shadow that's interesting in that light is that you can't really, I guess you could, but you can't really fully go there without someone else. You kind of need to have a third party.
I hear that. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, so to that end, I mean, we don't have to get into technique, but what does shadow work look like in a therapy office? I mean, you mentioned that example of kind of calling out maybe something that we're looking to avoid, but yeah. Where else does that go?
Well, you've heard of the phrase "name it to tame it."
Sure. Yeah.
Right. Is that DBT? I think is what says that. So whenever you call out something, you become aware of it. It stops having power over you. Mm-hmm. So the first step is to kind of be aware of what's in the shadow, and then there's a process that you go through. Like, you can either say, "No, fuck that, I'm not going there," or you can say, "Yeah, that's what I want to do," or you can negotiate. So like if your partner were to say, Christy, you're really funny, you should tell more jokes. Just dumb example, but you know, you could either say, you're right, I'm going to tell so many jokes, or you can say, no, you know me, I'm a serious guy, I'm so serious. Or you can say, well, sometimes there's an appropriate time to tell jokes and sometimes there's not. That's an example of like the method or the procedure of shadow work is seeing how you want to integrate it into your life. But it has to come from that first place of name it to tame it, to understand that it's there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Is there anything that you might highlight for us that people can take away from this conversation to just become more aware of their own shadow? I mean, outside of counseling, how can people take some of these ideas and maybe cultivate some curiosity about themselves, or perhaps about the things that they look away from in themselves?
I mean, there's multiple techniques. There's like the idea of dream work is always good, of kind of getting out of your element and seeing an abstract place. I think ultimately, maybe we should back up a little bit, because maybe I should define what the ego is before we go into that. So the ego is kind of defined in Jungian terms as like that navigation tool. It's kind of your perception of reality. So it's like, I am this. So if I know that I'm this, that's coming from the ego. It's not a bad thing. It's just kind of how we perceive the world. So if you think that you're like super awesome, then you have a overinflated ego. And if you think that you're like not very cool, then you have an underinflated ego. So we actually need the ego. It's not a negative thing. That's the main contention I have with the New Age movement, is saying kill the ego. I think we need the ego because we need to kind of be able to survive in this world. So anyway, the ego does need to step aside for us to grow. So if I just think, I'm Andy, I only listen to this type of music, I only like these type of movies, I only like to do this thing in the bedroom with my partner, then like we're never going to grow or expand. And so that's the tension there, is the ego versus the shadow. So techniques is what you asked me about. It's kind of like trying to introduce play, I guess, or getting out of an element. I know, Christy, you and I shared the same supervisor, Jen, and she told me a good technique to do with a client, if you're the therapist, is to write a question with your dominant hand to answer with a non-dominant hand. And that's an intervention that is a good way to kind of get you out of your left brain, which is kind of that concrete ego place, and get more
out
into
of your
abstract
routines.
place.
Introduce a little bit of like chaos and entropy as a way of perhaps getting at things from a different angle.
100%. 100%. And that's a therapy technique. But you can do that if you're journaling. That's just essentially active imagination. But the brain likes that kind of stuff. The brain likes new information and expanding. So neurons that fire together, wire together, baby.
Yeah, I don't want to get too down a rabbit hole, but I think it's worth stressing that our brains can be kind of lazy bastards sometimes. They're always looking for shortcuts. They're always looking to find ways to avoid doing extra work, which is great. It's why we're able to have this incredible computer that we carry around with us all the time. But when you use the same shortcuts, you start to get these sort of like automatic stimulus response. Yeah. And there's not a lot of curiosity and a lot of innovation and exploration of other possibilities. And so there are pieces of ourselves that get kind of locked away. Yeah.
I mean, even in a physical sense, neuroplasticity, right? Yeah. I remember reading that seniors should be learning new languages. And that, I guess, essentially, maybe you could argue that's shadow work. Mm-hmm. Maybe not. Who knows? I'm not an analyst. I just like this stuff.
So what are some of the benefits of this type of self-understanding? What kind of results do we see in folks that really dedicate themselves to this kind of work?
Yeah, I think the biggest benefit is, like I said, individuation. Trying to find an inner authority that's not based upon what other people say, but based upon what you think is true. One of the big cornerstones of Jung is the difference between a sign and a symbol. And he says we need to be living a symbolic life. So a sign would say, green means go, red means stop, right? But a symbol kind of means, what does a star mean to you? What is your phone mean to you?
And that kind of your archetypes start to come in.
This is where your archetypes start to come in, and that's where like your personality starts to shine, because you bring in what your associations are with that thing. So whenever you start thinking symbolically instead of as signs, then your life becomes less reductive, I think, because you look beyond what you're, I guess, seeing right in front of you. Yeah.
Well, so how can this embracement of our shadow or shadow-based counseling practices and these sorts of things, how do they help us to become better romantic partners? How do they impact our marriages or our relationships?
Yeah, like I was saying earlier, if you do shadow work, the best way to do it is with someone else. Because the problem with the unconscious is that it's unconscious.
Sure.
You can't see it. And so having someone call you out on what's going on in a very healthy, kind way, can help you individuate and grow. I really truly believe that relationships should be there to help us emphasize who we are, and that we should be more ourselves than we were before we were with that person. And that's I think that's a Jungian perspective of saying, Christy, you like to do this thing, so I want you to do this thing. How can I make this work for you and not have that negatively impact my life? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a conversation with my own therapist not that long ago, where we were talking about conflict in my relationship and how, there was just that porcupine's dilemma of two people trying to come together to huddle for
Hmm.
warmth, but constantly poking each other in the eye,
Yeah.
struggling to make it fit. And my therapist just asked me sincerely, like, is this relationship serving you? Like, is this something that you want to be a part of? And
Yeah.
my honest gut level response was, if I'm not in this relationship dealing with this issue right now, then in a year or five, I'm going to find myself in a different relationship working out the
Aha.
exact same problem in myself. This is something
Totally.
that I need to do, but that I don't know that I can do on my own. How does that line up with the way you see this?
100%. Jung's theory originally was called complex theory because he's the guy who created complexes. I forgot to mention that earlier. So, I think that complexes and complex theory could align really well with attachment theory right now.
Yeah, can you walk the audience through what we mean by that idea of a complex? I know
Yeah.
people might be familiar with terms like an inferiority complex or something along those lines.
Napoleon
What are we talking
complex.
about? Yeah, what do we mean when we say those terms?
So when we say those terms, to my understanding, what we're meaning is the patterns by which we have adopted in relating to other people throughout our nurturing in our life. So I might have a complex about failure or a complex about rejection. And that's not my current, what is today, October 14th, issue with my partner. That's me as a 35-year-old man bringing all this shit to the surface. And so these complexes stay with us and they continue kind of haunting us, to kind of go with the Halloween theme, like ghosts. And the way that we get out of that is through taking away their power, which is through working it out with our relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Which is healing trauma or attachment wounds, essentially.
Yeah, bringing something out of the unconscious and up to the surface where it can get a little bit of light on it and kind of maybe wither under that light if it's something that isn't serving us. Do I have the model?
100%. I mean, have you ever been in an argument with someone and you're in a complex and they're in a complex, and then all of a sudden, like, you kind of snap to it and you go, what are you talking about? Because what you're talking about is not what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And your actions and your reactions of what I'm saying are like totally not rational. And I'm not rational either. Where are we? That's when we're like caught in a complex. Totally. And if you're sitting at home and you're isolated, so we're in COVID still. If you're isolated, it's hard to get out of that head spin. And that's why therapy is great, because your therapist can kind of help you through that. That's why friendship is good too. It doesn't have to be romantic.
Yeah. So talk to me then about some of this like sexual shame that we're discussing and how that might be at play here. If you have a secret desire for a particular type of sexuality, or if you are spending a lot of your life in the closet and these different things, how does that impact your shadow, or how can this type of work maybe offer some healing in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, so when you think about like the brilliant nature of the way that we sustain life on the planet, it's through sex, which means play.
Sure. Yeah, I love that notion of conceiving of sex as a form of mammalian play. That's a drum that I like to beat a lot on this show. And I don't know how many therapists, honestly, really have that conceptualization of it.
It's just play. And it's so funny thinking about, if someone has stoic parents, them playing, there's a old Woody Allen quote from Annie Hall, and Woody Allen is problematic, but the quote goes, they had sex and she goes, how was it? And he goes, it was the most fun I ever had without laughing. And I love that, you know? And so anyway, I'm getting somewhere with this. So play is what we do when we're in the bedroom. We're playing. And so if you have something that's repressing you, that's like way down, that's stopping you, like maybe you, let's put it in a different context of just like simple play. Maybe you really want to play with the green shovel when you're doing a sandcastle, but you don't want to tell your friend, can I use your shovel? I really want to use your shovel. That's shadow work, is getting the courage to feel comfortable to finding a way to play better. And so not doing shadow work like really impacts the way that we have sex, our intimacy, play. And so that there's that, but then also as far as identity goes, you know, if someone is in the closet, well, that's shadow work in itself. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I want to just take a quick moment to remind folks that they can call in with their stories and with their questions. There's a lot to unpack here, and so we'd really love to hear your voices. So it's not just two therapists talking about therapy. We'd love to hear your curiosities and do what we can to kind of unlock some of these things. So if you'll give us a try, we're at 512-991-9242. That's 991-9242. But for the moment, let's take a look at what's been going on around the rest of the atheist community of Austin.
Not that I want to like endorse misgendering, but if it's a cis person and they're calling you like the absolute wrong pronoun, you're like, oh yes, thank you, ma'am, to like a big burly cis man.
For a long time, I've known about a thing that they call soaking,
Right,
which
right.
is where he puts it in and then they don't do anything.
Yes.
Because the Lord's vision, like T-Rex, is based on movement.
Wait, as the guest host here, am I obligated to say vagina at any point? If I am expected to say it, I could come up with some kind of weird excuse to try to work it into the conversation.
You can just listen. Close your eyes.
You
Listen
won't have
to
to look at our faces.
No, you don't have to. This is in podcast form. You can look at something else. Look at the trees.
That is my legacy. That is what I've left for the world. That is my legacy. You're welcome, internet. You're welcome. Also, vagina.
Well, shit, vagina. I guess I had to.
Vagina.
Well, Andy, I know we touched on this, but Jung's work is pretty directly descended from Freud. I know that they had something of a relationship. A lot has been sort of written and maybe even like read in to that relationship. But Jung takes a lot of criticism for having some ideas that are somewhat unfalsifiable. You know, this notion of the shadow as something of a metaphor is not anything that we can actually like cut out and examine on an operating table or, spectro image. So how fair is that critique that there's no evidence-based or that's resistant to evidence-based understandings of the world?
It's super fair. I mean, one of my favorite quotes by Jung, you're going to love it, is, "Thank God I'm Jung and not a Jungian." And the reason why is he's like, make your own fucking theory. I don't know. I'm doing my thing, so do your thing. So he never wanted to create something that was mass produced for people who are fresh out of grad school to apply to a counseling session.
Sure.
It was all just his own personal understanding, which was, a big contention with Freud. I mean, Freud at the time was like the guy. I mean, there was no one who was like Freud. He was the guy.
It's weird to overstate the way that he was sort of a rock star scientist in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And Jung was like, well, I don't think that everything is about sex. And I have this idea of complexes and I have these other concepts that I want to apply. And so I think it's very valid to say you can't take his concepts and put it on a table and, you know, dissect it. It's more of an existential theory, but his whole thing is saying, create your own inner authority, individuate, write your own theory. I want you to understand me in the sense that I'm a symbol that you can do it too. And that kind of concept is what a lot of analysts use whenever they're, you know, doing sessions.
Sure. Well, do you conceive of the shadow as a metaphor for, you know, something that might be a little bit more measurable, or is that a flawed way of thinking about it? Like, is it a set of human behaviors that we could, on some level, be able to like do, you know, factorials and run statistics on, or does it require a certain like ineffability in order to be effective?
I think it requires a little bit of subjectivity. Yeah.
Sure.
Of kind of like, you can't measure what is in the shadow, but you know what's in the shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a personal, subjective situation. It's not objective at all. And that's what's frustrating about it, right? I mean, that is what's frustrating about it. These concepts are so cool, and you can't quantify them. You really can't, and that's a little bit scary, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that these
Halloween.
are like necessary and sort of useful ideas, like the metaphor of these things, the idea of internal family systems, the notion that there is like a boardroom table maybe, or like the control booth that you saw in the film Inside Out, where all of these different emotions or all these different like characters are sitting down and sort of debating within you. I think that there's incredible value to that, but I also know it sort of necessitates a form of mysticism maybe that I think has gotten really abused in a lot of ways. I mean, are you aware of some of those like maybe pop psychology kind of woo-woo pseudoscience that maybe has been grafted onto some of these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Jung at his best is talking about transcending two conflicting ideas. I think this, but I also think this. So what am I going to decide in order to evolve as becoming more Andy in my life? And that's him at his best, is like, how can I at the end of my life say I showed up truly as Andy and not what everyone else said? And that's him at his purest. That's why I like him. But it has been bastardized in the sense of like, I guess the tarot is cool. I think the tarot is cool, me personally, but there's no it's not efficacious, right? The tarot is not efficacious. It's like, what do you think about this Tower card? Oh, well, I don't know. I mean, if I think about symbolism, well, I've been working really hard in my life, and so I'm trying to build the tower. Okay, that's cool. That gets you someplace, but that's not exactly a results-oriented type of thing. You can't quantify that. And anyway, the tarot predates Jung, but he's often lumped into that category of all those things. And he didn't make it easy. Jung didn't make it easy. Let's be fair.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair to say. There is something of a cult of personality that circled him a lot of his life, yeah? Yeah. I mean, he was even interested in the occult and Gnosticism. I mean, he wrote an entire book in Gnosticism, but that's because he came from a religious background, and so he was exploring that. One of the interesting stories about Jung is in his book Memories, Dreams, and Reflections that he wrote like 10 years before he died. It was an autobiography, and everyone wanted to have, a more tangible piece of work by him that they could read to understand his concepts. His dad was a preacher. His dad was a pastor. And Jung, when he was 3 years old, had this dream that there was golden feces coming from the sky, taking a shit on his dad's church. And he had so much shame behind that. So it was lodged in the shadow of like,
I can't tell anyone about this golden shit coming from the sky dream on my dad's church. Are you kidding me? But he was also like, how is that a negative thing? I was 3 years old. How a 3-year-old won't be like,
shame
oh,
coming
Dad.
from?
Yeah.
I think that's a tricky part of all of this is you can have a dream and it can have significance to you, and discussing that with somebody else and processing that, trying to understand those symbols, it can be predictive in the sense that it can tell you a little bit about yourself, about what your focus or your fears or where your attention is, and those kinds of things. And so it's going to perhaps relate to what may happen to you because it's connected to who you are and where you're putting your focus and your attention. None of that means that it is like mystically, magically connecting you with some piece of like supernatural information. And that distinction is something that our culture has like really struggled to hold correctly in the 100 years since we were introduced to these ideas. I mean, is that a fair way of framing the conversation?
Yes. Thank you so much for saying that. I think that's so, I think that needs to be said. You know, I have a dream about a guy who I didn't get along with for a long time, and he keeps showing up in my dreams. And that doesn't mean that I need to wake up the next day and call him and say, "Hey, dude, let's work this out." Like, I've been dreaming about you. It means that there's a tension within myself that I have with this guy that I need to work out on my own. Mm-hmm. That's an inner character that I have in my head of like, why do I feel uncomfortable with this type of person? Why do I feel weird about this? There's no woo-woo cosmic connection that I have that means I need to call this guy. It's that in my unconscious, when I'm dreaming, I'm trying to process this information. And I can do that in a therapy session, or I can do that with my partner or my friend, or on this podcast if you want me to hear about my dream. No, I'm just joking. And so, yeah, it's not cosmically connected. But I will say this, though, Christy. Jung is famous for the collective unconscious. That's one of the big things that separates him from Freud. And that's also one of the big things that makes him misunderstood. So the collective unconscious is basically this idea that we are all collectively dreaming the same thing or thinking the same thing or all that kind of stuff. Just on paper, that's what it says. But if you think about it in like a evolutionary terms, I don't dream about being on Twitter. I don't dream about being on Facebook, but I do dream about being chased by an alligator, and I do dream about walking on snakes. So if I think about that in like an evolutionary term, like that's kind of like way back in the day, we were in this fight or flight mode of like needing to get away from snakes and alligators. And so I think kind of an intergenerational, genetic way, we have this unconscious way of dreaming that is archetypes and symbols of specific ancient things, not because of any type of spirituality of any sort, but predominantly because our species was trying to stay alive. And so we needed to create these synapses to form together. So I think that that's kind of what Jung was trying to get at, is like, why are we all dreaming the same things? Why are there dreams that are repeating? And I think it comes back more to a biological thing than a spiritual thing.
Yeah, that there's some commonality here, that there are reasons why we're all going through in some ways the same experiences and having in some ways the same results. That being said, anybody who had a confusing dream recently that has been like waiting for confirmation from the universe that it was true, I guess we can just let this conversation be that. If I just fucked with anybody's head, I'm sorry. But so we're more than 100 years into Jung's like first published work. how
Right.
has our understanding of some of his concepts evolved? I know you mentioned the sort of evolution or the growth of our understanding of personality and how that's resulted eventually in things like Myers-Briggs and some of these other things. What else might you highlight here?
I think it's taken steps forward in the sense of, like, if you think of Joseph Campbell has that idea of the hero's journey. And for those of you who don't know, that's that concept of that we all go through certain stages in life to go through, I guess, issues and overcome them, gain allies, and come back home changed forever. And it's kind of this like universal, template. And that wasn't Jung. That was created by Joseph Campbell, from my understanding. I could totally be wrong about all this stuff. I'm the first to admit it. That would be the shadow, Christy. That would be the shadow.
Right. Yeah. That willingness to say I'm not perfect and I'm not entirely aware of some of my flaws.
Yes. And I think that more of an existential way, it's been super applicable throughout, I guess, recent times. Like, if you think about the shadow as embracing doubt and embracing the unknown, well, that'll put a bad taste in your mouth. But if you don't embrace the shadow, then you have blind faith. So, doubt will put a bad taste in your mouth, but blind faith will put, planes through the Twin Towers.
Sure.
So I think that it's important to apply it in many ways. And I think that we're taking steps towards that. But yeah, Myers-Briggs, IFS, Joseph Campbell, some people who are abusing it. There's a certain guy who's very, 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 very famous for incorporating Jung, and I don't even want to say his name on this podcast. But there's a lot of people who are abusing Jung, and I think it's important to go back to the source.
Fair to say.
Yeah.
Well, in the show notes for this episode, there is a meta-analysis study that I've got linked that looks at some of the outcome data for Jungian analysis, and kind of evidences through an examination of all these different studies the comparability that it has to other forms of like counseling or psychology. But I guess I'm curious what you could say about sort of the efficacy of these therapies, and what we can say about it now that we have all of this time with these ideas.
So Jung, as I said earlier, Jung really wanted to be accepted by the scientific community. He had the word association test when he was very young. I think it was in his early 30s, and that was super efficacious. And that was really the only thing that he specifically did in his life. The scientific community was like, yes, stamp of approval. And he always wanted more than that. But after that, I've heard studies about group therapy that's Jungian oriented, surrounding the hero's journey and myths that echo throughout your life. And that's helped with reincarceration rates for people in prison. And the Myers-Briggs has been super helpful for a lot of people. I mean, I can probably pull up a bunch of, data on how that's helpful, but Jung himself.
Psychometrics is probably, I mean, all counseling, all psychology really as a field has a certain like artistry to it,
right,
and a certain, challenge in being measured. Psychometrics is, if not an exception to that, probably the place where that's the least true. And
Right.
Myers-Briggs is probably the gold standard in that field, or at least close to it. Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And I think that the entire idea of Jung going down this path and this journey of becoming, a psychoanalyst or the psychoanalyst, is a shadow thing, because he, like I said before, he was the thinker, he was the scientific guy, and for him this was going in the other realm. And so he died being very sad, because he said that only the poets and artists would understand him. And sure enough, there have been things that have been built off of his theory, but he died sad that he wasn't being taken seriously. And like I said before, he did some stuff like invested in the occult and all that kind of stuff that didn't make it easy. He didn't make it easy for the scientific community, to be fair.
Yeah, we have a lot to sort through. But to that end, I actually have a caller on the line with some interest in Myers-Briggs. So let me actually touch base with Nate. Nate, what are you curious about?
Hello, Christy. Hello, Andy. Here I am on Secular Sexuality.
Howdy, sir.
How you guys doing?
Hey, not too bad.
Love it.
Hey, I had a question about these Myers-Briggs tests because my impression, and admittedly as a layperson, was that these tests were sort of debunked as useful because they can't really make predictions. They can't really tell you are you going to be compatible with this person? Are you going to like your new job? And like, I kind of wonder whether assigning humanity to a certain set of 16 possibilities, like it kind of reminds me of astrology. And the problem for me with Myers-Briggs, and again, I'm open to having my mind changed. I'm just asking questions here. The problem for me is that you're answering the question. So at some point, does it not reflect who you want to be or who you wish you were rather than what you actually are? And is that useful in practice? I kind of want to hear you guys talk about that.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let Andy take that. But before I do, I guess to your point, Nate, I was telling Andy a story before the show about an experience my partner and I had recently when we were looking to find couples counseling and we're going through a consultation with another therapist. And it was all of the problems that you're suggesting. This was basically, it was the opposite of the episode we did last time Andy was here when we talked about how to find the right therapist for you. I'm very sorry if she happens to be watching. I don't mean to hurt her feelings, but it was just a terrible consultation in large part because...
I don't want to be offensive, but it was terrible.
Now I'm saying with all due respect, yeah, she had us take a very quick and dirty Myers-Briggs test and then was looking at the comparison between my partner and I and was like, oh, I bet your relationship must be like this. And I bet you must have conflict around this, as if she could tell us about our relationship rather than ask us about our relationship. And so, there is that challenge of trying to take something that might be true in aggregate, and when we're talking about large numbers of test takers, and then trying to force it into a particular scenario or situation. Anyway, I just wanted to jump in with that story. But Andy, tell me how you respond to Nate's question.
Yeah, I think, Nate, you're going to hate that I'm saying this, but I think the person who asks that is a certain type. But anyway,
okay, Andy, tell me what type I am, because I've actually like every teenager alive, I have taken this test multiple times. So to take a wild guess.
Let me ENTJ.
That doesn't feel that far off.
Okay, well, I retract my question as far as predictive abilities, because you literally just nailed it. Wow.
Holy shit. There we go. Well, I think that
you did literally ENTJ. Every time I've taken this, it's ENTJ. Yeah.
I think to answer your question, the big thing is what are you trying to get out of it? So if you're taking the Myers-Briggs and you're like, ooh, I really want to be really cool. Well, then you're not taking the Myers-Briggs for the right reason. If you're taking the Myers-Briggs to being well, I want to understand myself more. Well, then that's the right reason. So faking the questions will get you result in one way or the other. But if we think what I was saying earlier about symbolic versus sign. So a symbol versus a sign. What does being an extrovert mean to you?
Right.
You know, what is being an intuitive mean to you? And how can you think about that whenever you are hanging out with friends and applying that throughout your life? So it's not that it's like, oh, I have this score and I'm good to go. It's more kind of like, how can I apply this as a tool for the future? But, you know, I also want to say before I end responding to you that I'm totally the same way. Like, I don't like being pigeonholed to one thing or the other. And that's why I'm very reluctant to be kind of like with a client on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling today? Because that that feels reductive to me, unless I'm doing a line graph and I'm seeing like what's going on with them. I totally get what you mean about being like, I'm more than just these letters. So I want to just honor that also. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just as a therapist, that's one reason why I don't lean into these kinds of things. But I do want to say, even if we might have questions about their efficacy in terms of like therapeutic value, that the incredible amount of data that we have about the accuracy of these measurements is pretty significant. Psychometrics is maybe one area of psychology where we see tons and tons of like numerical, like mathematically calculated accuracy. And in a like developing and very like squishy, soft, human-based science, that's something to maybe take some real interest in. Yeah.
I think that's right.
See how accurate was your couples therapist?
Oh man, so far off. So and that to me is the significant thing about counseling just as a profession. And I really appreciated so much of what Andy said in that episode where we talked about how to find a good therapist. And I would encourage folks to take a look at it if you didn't catch it, and if that's a stage in life that you're at right now. But people are individuals and they want to talk about themselves. And so much of therapy is the therapist getting the hell out of the way and providing that opportunity. So to come in and say, well, you are this, this, and this because I read it in a book, to me is like really anathema to the entire notion of what we're here to do.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I'm quite impressed that you pegged me for that, Andy.
I knew the J. I got the J easy.
Well, I like to think that there are 15 different universes where you got it wrong, but I'm so glad to live in this one.
Well, we're in the right multiverse where Andy got it right. So.
The luckiest timeline.
So one more question then before I hop off. Sure. Why do you guys think that there is so much pushback against this method if it is truly useful in practice?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think the big reason is because it's so dense. So the world of Jungian analysis and Freud and Lacan and a bunch of other people is depth psychology. It's not self-help. It's not something that you can just pick up and go, hell yeah, method, I can apply it, here we go. It's very, very, very dense. I mean, the big joke with the world of Jung is we don't read Jung, we read about Jung. Because it's so complex. It's like too much. So I think a big pushback is well, firstly, he was interested in some very out there shit. You know, that's number one, his life. Number two is that it's so dense and specific to him, subjective to him, that it's hard for, you know, the regular Joe to just pick it up and be like, oh, cool. This is what the anima is. This is what the collective unconscious is. So I think it's just so dense that people get overwhelmed.
And I think it's also just been around long enough for a lot of people to sit in college dorm rooms smoking a joint and talk about it and to convince themselves that they understand it, and then continue to propagate ideas that are increasingly divorced from, the actual science of the thing.
Yes, I think that's true. It sounds like fun.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying keep it in perspective. You want to invite me to your dorm room, Andy? I'm here for it.
Have a coffee chill time with everyone together and say,
sure,
what was real? What did we just experience last night?
What are we even doing here, man?
I think that's real. I think that's true. Yeah.
Well, Nate, I appreciate you giving us the call. I hope that we were able to clear some of that up for you.
Yes, that was interesting. I was really interested to hear a rebuttal to the Myers-Briggs thing, because all I have to go on as a layperson is what I see on the internet, and like I said, it kind of looked to me like astrology. I don't know if you've ever seen the James Randi experiment, where he gives people a survey and asks them to fill out, well, what do you think about yourself? And then he's like, yeah, you all got the same test. So, but no, that was useful. So, great show. And thank you for taking my call.
Hey, appreciate you, friend. You have a great night. All right. Well, Andy, I have got some notes in the show notes to this episode for folks that want to crawl through a little bit of the data around some of these things. But where can people who are curious about some of the science of all of this learn a little bit more?
I don't know about the science of it. I know specifically there's a book by my Jungian analyst, Pittman McGehee, J. Pittman McGehee, that talks about the neuroscience of what psychotherapy with him does to the brain. He saw you call them analysand. So if you have it's like a client. If you have a Jungian analyst, you have an analysand as a client. So his analysis, mentee. So his analysand was a neuroscientist, and they wrote a book together. I don't know what it's called offhand, but it's by J. Pittman McGehee.
Okay. And I'll make sure to have that in the show notes to this episode. We'll track that down.
Cool. Did I talk about the process to become an analyst yet? Did we talk about that? I know we talked about that before, but were we?
I think it's actually worth taking a moment to kind of highlight what that process looks like and how detailed it is.
Yeah. So in order to become an analyst, so first of all, in Austin right now, if you throw a rock, you'll hit a therapist. It's just like a thing, right? But if you throw a rock, you will 100% miss an analyst, because there's, I think right now, only 4 living analysts in Austin. Jungian analysts, because the training is so intense. In order to become an analyst, you have to have your master's degree. You have to have a license in some type of counseling, so that's like social work, LPC, LMFT, or a PhD in which you have, your doctorate in psychology. And then you have to be above 25 as an age. And then also you have to have 100 hours of analysis yourself with a certified Jungian analyst before you apply. So then you apply, and the program takes about 5 years. It's a second
doctorate to become an analyst.
Yeah, it really is, and you get a diploma at the end of it. And at the end, there's 5 tests you have to take. One of which is you have to be well versed in the DSM, so it has a test on the DSM and on the whatever current version that is at the time, and on your understanding of it, your understanding of complexes, your understanding of myth, your understanding of dream analysis. And so it's not just like, it looks to the public like it is you're sitting around a dorm room smoking weed and like talking about fucking archetypes, you know? But in truth, there's only 4 in Austin that are Jungian analysts. And I think that that's important to kind of highlight, is not the version that we think of it, but the actual, like, the Jedi Knights that are out there that are actually doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, with that in mind, I almost wonder about my next question. But if folks are curious and wanting to explore these ideas for themselves, does that feel appropriate? Is there something you would point them towards? I mean, what value might that have?
So I think if you're interested in Jung, the best thing to do is to read his read about Jung. Like we made that joke earlier. So I have a few books here. I don't know if my camera's reversed. Let's see. One of the ones that I have is Owning Your Own Shadow by Robert A. Johnson. And that's about, you know, Jung and his dealings with the shadow. Another one that I think this is actually the best one to read would be Why It's the worst title. It's the worst title, Christy. Why People Do Bad Things by James Hollis. Worst title. He hates it. His editor made him do it. And that is honestly, it's the best book about the shadow. Why good people do bad things by James Hollis. So good. If you're interested at all in learning about it, that's the book to go to. Owning Your Own Shadow is great too. Robert Johnson's great. Robert Johnson was an analysand of Jung.
Perfect. Well, I'll make sure to have links to those in the show notes for the episode. Any other like resources or recommendations you have for us?
That's really it. Yeah.
Sure.
Good luck. Have fun.
Yeah.
GLHF. Good luck. Have fun.
Well, well, ultimately, do you have any final thoughts that you want to be sure to leave the audience with tonight? I know that we're talking about some pretty big ideas and unpacking a lot here. So what's sort of the coda that you want to put on all of this for folks watching at home?
I think the big thing is to whatever therapy you have, whatever practice of self-exploration you go through, the greatest contribution that Jung gave us was the idea of becoming more yourself than you've ever been. So, which means individuation, right? So if you're going to be in a relationship with someone, does that relationship serve you in the sense of that you're more yourself now than you were when you were single or whenever you're with the other person before that? If you're at the career that you're at, are you being celebrated being more you than you were yesterday? And that's uniquely Jung to me. That idea of like really walking away saying, I showed up, warts and all, shadow, as Andy, as Christy. And yeah, I just hope that if anything is printed on people's minds today. Yeah,
Absolutely. Well, I want to take a moment and give folks who are interested in learning more about like you and your work an opportunity to do that. Where can people find you on the web?
Yeah, so I live in Austin. My website is andylanecounseling.com. Oh, look at that. There it is. I got an Instagram. I post every now and then. Yeah, I see clients online, and I will soon, once the Delta variant calms down, see people in person. Please don't call me. Please email me, because I don't really ever answer unknown numbers. So if you want to check me out at those places.
All right, perfect. Well, I want to make sure to encourage folks to check out some of the other ACA shows. There are a bunch of ways to do that. One of the best is at tiny.cc/AEN podcast, where you can get a audio blend of all of our different programs. Absolutely. I want to keep this conversation going. Before this episode aired, there was some lively debate about sort of maybe the value or the merits of Jungian psychology. And I'd now love to hear what everybody thinks about this discussion about sort of the squiggy, pseudo-science-y things that we've tried to unpack in all of this mysticism. So join us on the Facebook fan group where you can connect with me and with other hosts who have been on the show and with other fans, and let us know what you thought about this episode, what you thought about this exploration. I'll also say that if you're catching this live, Andy and I are going to be jumping into the atheist community of Discord, and you can check that out as well as embrace your atheist community at tiny.cc/ACD Discord. I also hope that you will help us keep the lights on by taking a look at some of our merch. That's at tiny.cc/merchaca, where you can find our t-shirts and mugs and all kinds of great products.
Is that a pillow? Is it a pillow?
Yeah, it is.
That's cool. I like that. That's great.
And then finally, I want to embrace the most important part of the night, where we get to say thank you to all of the incredible hardworking folks that make this show happen. Take a look at our crew cam, all of those folks sporting their sexy Sexuality shirts. Thank you all so much for everything that y'all do to make Andy and I look good, even when we unplug all of our equipment and try to screw everything up. We appreciate y'all so much. Andy, super excited to have you here. It was a lot of a fun conversation for me. These are ideas that I have, kicked around, since Psychology 101. But to be able to have you walk me through them in this way is a absolute joy and a pleasure. So thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yeah, man, I'm so happy. I love Jung so much, and it's good chilling with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. We hope that we'll hear more from you. But in the meantime, I want to invite you, without any shame, without any self-judgments, to accept yourself as you are and maybe be willing to give yourself a big old orgasm. Or
dissolve that shadow. Dissolve it.
Right?
Yeah.
Or better yet, give somebody else one.
Yeah.
Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.